Did you know there's a country where they don't use forks? Well, technically not anymore, but they did for a long time. And it turns out, there's a really interesting reason why. Hey there, and welcome to History Reboot. Here, each week we bring you an entertaining, educational, and always interesting look into the distant past. And today is no different, as we're going to be taking a look at when Italy banned forks. Now, if you're anything like me, you may have never even considered a world without forks. It's hard to imagine how people managed before the advent of this simple, but effective eating implement. But trust me, Europeans managed just fine for hundreds of years without one, or rather they did until the late 10th or early 11th century, depending on who you ask. This is when forks started appearing in Europe. More specifically, the region that would become Italy had been a part of the Roman Empire, which had fallen in the 5th century AD. And after that, they sort of took a step back into the Dark Ages. The Byzantine Empire, which had its roots in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, lasted significantly longer than its western counterpart. In fact, it wasn't until 1453 that it fell to the Ottoman Turks. Throughout this time, the Byzantines were exposed to the luxuries of China through merchants along the Silk Road, including an item called a fork. They brought these implements over and used them alongside spoons for eating. They were generally made of wood, bone, or metal, usually silver, and were often quite expensive. While the upper classes enjoyed forks, the common folk didn't use them and instead ate with their hands. However, during the Crusades, European Christians ventured into the East and encountered the fork. Intrigued by this new eating tool, they brought it back home. So now you're probably thinking, well, problem solved, right? We figured out why Italy had a fork ban. They just didn't have them. But it turns out it was much more complicated than that. Most historians agree that the first Italian to introduce forks to the general public was a certain Monaldo of Tuscany. He got the idea while on crusade and immediately saw the potential such a tool had for the restaurant industry. Of course, some of the more conservative folks weren't thrilled about this development. The clergy were especially uneasy about adopting something so foreign. In fact, they believed it was heretical. After all, God had given man hands to eat with. Why did we need a fork? To make matters worse, some church leaders thought the fork was downright evil. You see, the design of the fork somewhat resembled a pitchfork, an object commonly associated with the devil. And so if the fork was the devil's tool, then to eat with it would be to sin. Ultimately, this argument wasn't very successful. Over time, forks became widely accepted throughout Italy. But in the northern region of Tuscany, where Monaldo lived, things got heated. There was a sizable contingent of conservatives who fought tooth and nail against the adoption of forks. They were led by Matteo di Giovanni, a friar and canon of San Miniato al Monte. Matteo detested forks. He was appalled at what he perceived as humanity's insatiable desire for luxury and excess. In his sermons, he warned that forks were nothing more than instruments of vanity, lust, and gluttony. To use a fork was to stray from the teachings of Christ. Matteo took special aim at young women who he accused of using forks to groom themselves and attract men. He claimed that the tinkling of forks could be heard at taverns where young girls would gather and flirt. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds kind of nice. All I can think about is brunch at Tiffany's. Anyway, although influential, Matteo was unable to stem the tide of progress. Eventually, his bishop ordered him to stop preaching about forks altogether. Still, this resistance was fairly significant. In 1096, a local bishop attempted to ban the use of forks outright. In response, the Bishop of Pistoia wrote a pastoral letter denouncing the ban. He said that while other regions happily adopted forks, Tuscany was being held back by ignorance. Then just 5 years later, the Bishop of Fiesole issued a bull prohibiting anyone from covering their bread with a napkin while eating, presumably to prevent any oil or gravy from falling onto the clothes of the wealthy elite. That way, they wouldn't have to use a fork to clean themselves. Obviously, this had the opposite effect and only bolstered the resolve of those opposing forks. They were outraged at what they viewed as an attack on their customs. However, those arguments were drowned out by the growing support for forks throughout the rest of Italy. For example, the Countess Matilda of Tuscany invited French chefs to her house so she could learn how to use a fork properly. A short time later, most of the Italian nobility followed suit, and forks quickly became a status symbol among the wealthy. As for those who couldn't afford them, it was easier to use a spoon or simply eat with their hands. They knew their place and didn't complain. However, not everyone felt that way. Many ordinary citizens resented having to watch the rich enjoy their fancy new toys. And so the growing popularity of the fork soon turned into a full-blown Italian fork riot. These protests were especially pronounced in Florence. Around 1123, the city council tried to appease both sides by instituting Fork Etiquette Day. This was a day where poor people could borrow forks from the wealthy and eat with them, albeit under close supervision. However, this compromise failed, and the unrest continued. People were tired of being told how to live. They wanted forks, and they wanted them now. Then in 1125, another law was passed. This one prohibited anyone from using a fork larger than the width of their hand. Most likely, this was intended to drive up costs and discourage the use of forks, but it had the opposite effect. Now people wanted bigger forks to flaunt how wealthy they were. Ultimately, the pushback against forks died down as the 12th century wore on. Most likely this was because they had become too entrenched in society, and it was impossible to go back. Also, the conservative clergy had lost most of their power following the investiture controversy and the subsequent papal reform movement. Anyway, by the 13th century, the vast majority of Italians used forks, and the ban had been completely forgotten. Then fast forward a couple hundred years, and forks fell out of favor again. This occurred during the Renaissance, partly due to an increased focus on hygiene. Eating with your hands was seen as dirty, and utensils were more commonly washed after use. Additionally, the wealthy bought elaborate knives and forks and carried them with them at all times so they could eat properly wherever they went. They even had servants whose sole job was to polish them. Forks were no longer just a sign of wealth, but also a necessary tool to maintain one's refined image. Soon enough, forks were not only popular again, but also commonplace. In fact, forks had finally come into their own. Finally, Italy was on board with the fork trend, and so the ban was finally over. Thank you, and thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please hit the like button and subscribe if you want to catch more of our episodes.